This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In recent years, multiple U.S. Secretaries of Education, both Republican and Democrat, have called access to quality public schools a civil rights issue. At the same time, a growing number of states are facing court challenges to how they fund their K-12 systems. In a new project for Public Source, Mary Niederberger looked at these issues in Pennsylvania, including the long-term impact on students, schools, and communities where education dollars have been stretched to the breaking point. Mary, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks, Emily. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start at the top. Why was this a story you wanted to tell?
This was a story I've been wanting to tell for probably a decade because at several points in my career, I was assigned to cover at the same time very wealthy school districts and very poor school districts. And I would listen to parents in wealthy districts complain because perhaps a section of a high-level math or science or foreign language was eliminated, making it difficult for their children to schedule every high-level course before they graduated. And then I'd be in poor communities where the kids didn't even have high-level science, math, or foreign language. And I would also notice just great disparities in the physical facilities of the two communities. And I would think to myself, how can this exist in the same county?
How does Pennsylvania fund its schools?
The situation in Pennsylvania is we rely heavily on local property taxes, which I think a lot of states do. But we rank 46 out of the 50 states in terms of how much Pennsylvania supports the schools. So the local property taxes become way more important.
There's a lot of data in your story, Mary, and you do a nice job breaking it down for your audience, but you also provide some interactive charts for people to take a closer look at the numbers. One of them is looking at how much local tax revenue is generated per student across Allegheny County. And it's a really stunning disparity there. I mean, it ranged from $117 in Duquesne to more than 9 times that amount in Quaker Valley.
That's why I wanted to do this story, because I have been to these districts, and just in one county, you see this kind of disparity. So what factors into that? Yes, it's the real estate assessment in a community. So if you have a mall, as the Montour School District does, or you have high-priced homes, or you have industry, or you have a combination of all of those things, you can raise local wealth. But in Duquesne, there's nothing left. It's an old steel mill town. The steel industry left in the 1980s. Everything else moved out. Housing prices are low. So there's no ability to raise local revenue. I was told the other day by one of their officials, they can't even raise enough local revenue to cover the debt that they have.
You followed a group of 5th graders at Clairton Elementary, which is in one of the less affluent communities, when they went to visit a neighboring school that has a lot more money. And there you got what I considered a real heartbreaker of a quote. One of the kids was examining how clean and bright the school was, the big hallways, all the art supplies, and he asked, "Can you give me a membership to this school?"
Yes, the younger children don't seem to understand the situation. And on the few times when they get outside of the community and they see another district, that's exactly their kind of response. What's sadder, though, is when you get to the high school level and the kids understand the situation and they accept or they become resigned to the fact that they're not going to have as much and they don't get as much as other kids do.
What are some examples of the funding disparities among school districts that are close to each other geographically and in terms of demographics? So we're talking about different opportunities, we're talking about classes, courses, facilities. What did you see?
So the biggest difference that I saw, or the biggest disparity I saw, was between the Montour School District and the Stowe Rock School District. They're both in the western suburbs of the county. Montour is lucky enough to be the home of the mall at Robinson, which is a very big, very healthy mall. And they get the bulk of their real estate tax revenue from that mall. And they're actually opening an artificial intelligence lab this fall. They have what they call the first ever Lego brick maker space. The CEO of Lego came out to help them open it. They did a $50 million renovation to their high school. They have a new $50 million elementary school. They have a separate athletic complex at their high school. Then you go to Stowe Rocks. The school hasn't been renovated since 1979. Water comes in through the roof when it rains. Temperatures are up in the 90s when it's hot. The kids don't have modern computers. They don't even have novels to read in their English class. Their teachers photocopy novels they can find free on the internet on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper and staple them together, and that's how those kids read books.
How long would it take me to drive from one to another if I was visiting?
Oh, they're 3 miles apart, so maybe 7 or 8 minutes.
So clearly, these towns know each other, and they probably know something else, which is that there's a pretty big gap in their socioeconomics. Talk to us a little bit about that.
According to the Pennsylvania Department of Education, 79% of the 1,300 students in Stowe Rocks were economically disadvantaged, and 28% of the 2,900 students in Montour were economically disadvantaged. You also saw a higher poverty rate in Stowe Township, which is one of the two communities that make up Stowe Rocks. 40% of the students are living in poverty. When you look at the Montour School District, the two largest communities, it's 7.5% and 5.2% that live below the poverty line.
When we talk about disparity and opportunity, in some places it means the opportunity to take advanced placement classes, which in some cases can lead to college credit. How big a gap are we talking about?
We're talking about a large gap across the county. The Fox Chapel School District, which is a very wealthy district, offers 31 advanced placement courses. And then districts like Cornell, which is a small district of a couple hundred students, offers 1 advanced placement course.
We're talking with Mary Niederberger about her reporting on funding inequities in Pennsylvania's public schools. I wanted to mention that her project was supported in part by an EWA Reporting Fellowship. This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. CZI believes that every child should enter adulthood able to recognize and realize their full potential. And a whole child approach to personalized learning is the most promising way to achieve this vision. Visit chanzuckerberg.com/education for more information. EWA retains all editorial control over programming and content. Mary, Pennsylvania has a messy history when it comes to public education. What were the, quote, pauper schools, and why are they relevant in today's conversations about funding equity?
The history of the pauper schools is that when the state was first founded, wealthy people educated their children in private academies or through private tutors. Religious groups, German-speaking groups opened their own private schools and educated their children, but poor children didn't have any way to be educated. So the first public schools were open for poor children, and they were called pauper schools, and they gave just a very basic, minimal education. And there's a feeling here in the state, in particular by a group that has filed a lawsuit over this inequitable funding, that when you look at a district like a Stowe Rocks that has very little right next to a very wealthy district, that it almost seems like we've returned to the pauper schools.
Pennsylvania's Secretary of Education, Pedro Rivera, was actually one of the original plaintiffs in that lawsuit you just mentioned, back when he was a district superintendent. You spoke with him about that. What is that lawsuit asking for?
That lawsuit is asking for a hearing to be held on the inequities in education. They want to provide evidence of the wide disparities and inequities that take place across the state. They want to prove it. And then they want the court to order the legislature to adequately fund education, which the lawsuit plaintiffs estimate would cost another $3 billion to $4 billion. And then they want it distributed by a formula that is equitable and minimizes the disparities.
We've seen similar equity challenges in places like Connecticut, Texas, Kansas, where they've lingered for decades. What kind of timeline are people envisioning for a potential change? I'm guessing the students you spoke with will be long gone.
Yes, these students will be long gone. I mean, if I had to estimate, I would say years. They don't expect a hearing to happen until sometime in 2019. How long it would go on, I don't know. And then even if they are successful, because what they're doing is handing it back to the legislature as opposed to specifying exactly what they want, I imagine there'd be a long process that the legislature would go through, first of all, in determining where additional money would come from, and then secondly, coming up with a formula. What they have to be real careful about is coming up with a formula that doesn't take away from districts. There is sort of a sub-formula here in Pennsylvania, a new formula that took effect 2 years ago that really takes into account the wealth of a school district or the lack of wealth in a school district. And only a tiny portion of the new money to education goes through that. Some people have advocated putting all the money through that, but if they did that, Pittsburgh public schools, for instance, would lose millions and millions. So the obstacle in coming up with a formula is going to be one that provides more to the poor districts, but doesn't take away from the wealthy districts.
There are a lot of voices in this piece, including students. I'm wondering, for our listeners, what is your approach to interviewing young people? And how does that differ from when you were talking to the adults for this story?
Well, when we talked to the young people, when we first went out and introduced ourselves and said we wanted to do this project, they were really willing to sit down at that first meeting and rattle off everything they didn't have. Because the high school kids are very aware of what they don't have because they're involved in activities that take them to other districts. They're old enough to work in other communities and see what they have. But as time went by, sometimes they were less willing to be open. They were less willing to have a camera in their face. So we really had to build up a trust with them. I tried to stay in touch via text, not intrusively, but just in between saying, hey, we'd like to come out again. There were days when they agreed for us to come out and then they didn't want to see us. So we just turned around and left. We were very patient with them and we respected their boundaries. There was one student who allowed the cameras at his home, but others wanted everything to remain at the campus. So I would say developing a trust, being patient, not pushing them, and backing off when they didn't want to talk about things. That's what we learned.
Was there anything that surprised you about reporting this story? I know you're really familiar, obviously, with the topic from your wealth of experience on the education beat, but did anything sort of jump up and stun you?
I think the thing that surprised me and saddened me was the resignation that these high school kids had. I mean, they know what they don't have. The ones that are going to college know the obstacles they're going to face, particularly in the use of technology, because they haven't had access to that. And yet they are resigned to, we live in this community, there's not a lot of money, this is all we get. That was kind of shocking to me.
Did you pick up any new skills reporting this project? There's a lot of data that had to be crunched and a lot of interesting multimedia that took place as well, including some really nice head-on interviews with the students.
You know, the multimedia, the videos are fantastic. That's our visuals person here, Ryan Lowe. As much of the story, I feel, is told in these videos as it is in the words, and it's a great component to the story. In terms of skills and data that I learned, I don't know that I learned like new data crunching skills, but I will tell you that I took data that's out there and accessible and crunched it in a way that had the numbers tell the story that I had been seeing with my eyes visually for years. For instance, the chart you were talking about. We gathered all the enrollment numbers, and the first time we did it, we had just in-district enrollment, and some of the numbers didn't make sense. And then I realized we needed to include charter enrollment because the schools have to pay charter tuition. So it was taking data that was out there and crunching it in a way that told the story or confirmed what we saw in the visuals.
Well, let's jump for that to my next question, which is, what are a few story ideas for local reporters who might want to follow your lead in covering school finance and equity issues in their own states?
One thing that I would want to say about Pennsylvania, the reason why this really stands out, and if there's another state that's like this, then it would make sense. We have 500 school districts. 500 school districts for, I think, 1.7 million kids. If you look at other states around us, like Virginia and Maryland, Maryland has countywide schools. Maryland has 24 school districts for 860,000 kids. Virginia has 133 school districts for 1.3 million students. So part of the problem here is we have so many school districts that this whole tax revenue situation becomes so local. So I think if you are in a state where you're like us, where you have a lot of school districts, you're more likely to see this. I think that if you want to try to ferret out a story like this, what I would do is start looking at the statistics, find districts that have very high numbers of either economically disadvantaged kids or kids who qualify for free and reduced lunch. And then I would look at other factors like how many AP classes do they have? How many foreign languages do they have? And see whether or not the kids who fit those statistics are getting the same opportunities as the kids who don't fit those statistics.
That's a great question. And also, I would encourage people to look at things like teacher and principal leadership in those districts, the turnover, staffing levels. And also, things like bus start times. I mean, how long is the academic day, and enrichment programs and opportunity to make up missed classes. All of those things factor into a student's achievement.
That's correct. And what's happened here in Pennsylvania is districts like Stowe Rocks and districts like Clairton, the one you mentioned where the young child said, could they get a membership to the better school? These districts were decimated in regards to all of those kind of support programs in 2011 when an incoming governor cut $1 billion from the education budget. Those kind of things don't exist in a lot of these districts unless they get private foundation funding or grants.
Mary Niederberger is a longtime education reporter in Pennsylvania, currently with Public Source, and she's an EWA Reporting Fellow. Mary, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you, Emily.
And thank you, everybody. That wraps up another episode for us. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 71 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.